Hi, in this recording I want to look at another very key passage in the book of Romans. So Romans 1, 16 and 17 I think are the key verses of Romans. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to salvation to everyone believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. In the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous by faith will live. That's a very key verses. Romans 3:21 through 31 are also incredibly key. This is the heart of Romans soteriology, where soteriology means the study of salvation. So what is the solution to the human problem? This is, especially 21 through 26, or I think it is, that little short span in Romans 3 is the most compact soteriological statement in the entirety of the Bible. The heart of how we get right with God, the heart of the solution to the human problem is right there in those verses, Romans 3:21 through 26 or 7. So, this is a very important passage when it comes to Christian theology, especially from a Protestant standpoint. So in Romans 1:18 through 3:20, Paul has presented the human problem, which is the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness, and guess what? All have sinned. Of course, all have sinned is in this section, Romans 3:23, but that's basically a summary of what he's been saying in Romans 1:18 through 3:20. So Romans 3:19, right before this verse, right before Romans 3:20, basically says, by works of law, no flesh will be justified. We're not going to be able to do it. None of us, on the basis of our good work, so to speak, or our keeping of the Jewish law, if you would, none of us is going to be able to be saved. But, Romans 3:20, now God has shown his righteousness apart from the law. Apart from works of law, God has shown his righteousness. Now, N.T. Wright, and I believe he's right, and others have argued that back in Romans 1:17, the phrase, the righteousness of God, refers to God's righteousness. And in a previous discussion, we have talked about how the likelihood of that in the background in Psalms, in the background in Isaiah, it's just very likely that the phrase, the righteousness of God in Romans 1:17, refers to God's righteousness, his propensity to save Israel and the world. That primarily the emphasis in the phrase, the righteousness of God, is his desire to save. It may also include, as N.T. Wright says, his justice toward the ungodly. That's possible. But the focus of the phrase, God's righteousness, in the Jewish background and in Paul, is God's propensity to save, his covenant faithfulness, his desire to see people saved. And so God has now revealed his righteousness apart from the law. And he goes on, Paul goes on, however, to talk about human righteousness, which makes me wonder if there may be a little bit of a double entendre going up here, to where maybe the scholars have wasted time trying to argue, is it God's righteousness or is it human righteousness? Maybe Paul eventually wants us to hear both meanings. I personally lean toward that. So Romans 3:20, though, I think the default must be God's righteousness to start off with. But he's going to exploit the ambiguity or the polyvalence, the double entendre capacity, as it were, of that phrase, God's righteousness, the righteousness of God, to steer toward how humans can be declared righteous. So, but I think the starting point has to be God's righteousness. So now, God's righteousness has been revealed in a different way from the law. It is a righteousness, you see how the double entendre would work. But I think the starting point is God's righteousness is revealed. Apart from law, even though you might say it's witnessed by the law and the prophets, this is a kind of play on words. Righteousness apart from the law, that is the standards of righteousness in the Jewish law, but witnessed by the law and the prophets, where this law in the phrase law and prophets refers to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So he's kind of this. I think Paul does this. and this is why he's happy hunting ground for scholars and why there's so much confusion, because he can change, on a dime, he can change the connotation of the word he's using. So here he flips from the law as moral standards to the law as the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So when he says that this righteousness of God is witnessed by the law and the prophets, he's basically saying it is testified to in Scripture. And he's going to give verses, for example, in Romans 4, he'll give some verses from the Psalms that point to this righteousness by faith. So, law and the prophets is shorthand for in Scripture. So, this is a righteousness that is not on the basis of works of law. Now, the phrase works of law is a debated phrase. And I'll give you my version of Paul on this. So when you go to Galatians, which is earlier than Romans, Paul uses the phrase works of law. And I think it's fairly clear by the debates that are going on in Antioch, for example, in Galatians 2, that when you look in the bubble above Paul's head, what he means by works of law are things like, should we get circumcised? Do Gentiles have to abstain from meat that's been sacrificed to idols for Jews to eat with them? What if a Gentile strangles his meat rather than letting the blood out? Can a Jew eat with a Gentile then? These are questions about the works of law. And there's actually a Dead Sea Scroll that was discovered in the 1940s called 4QMMT, which the translation of what those letters stand for is some of the works of the law. And so people like James Dunn and N.T. Wright have pointed out that the phrase works of the law for Jews often had a connotation of debates over finer points of purity rules or finer points of how you were to do certain things. And so the background of this phrase works of law, and I think this is especially clear in Galatians, the background was not just doing works, good works in general, but the background of this phrase was specific issues of Jewish law, especially the ones that distinguish Jew from Gentile. And so that when Paul says in Galatians that we are not justified by works of law, he seems to primarily be thinking about we are not made right with God because we're circumcised. And we are not made right with God because we drain the blood from our meat before we eat it. We are not made right with God because we don't eat meat that's been sacrificed to an idol. We are made right with God by faith, Paul basically says. Now, in Romans, there are those who would push back. Michael Bird, Doug Moo, there are plenty of people who would push back and say, though in Romans, works of law seems to be more general than just those kinds of things. Even James Dunn, who championed this position in what's called the New Perspective on Paul back in the 80s, even James Dunn has backed up a little from the idea that Paul only means things like circumcision and Sabbath observance and so forth. I do think that in Romans, Paul does generalize works of law to be more anything that you might think about the Jewish law that would make you right with God on the basis of earning it. And Romans 4 seems to especially bring that out. Although, interestingly, circumcision is the issue in Romans 4. So even in Romans 4, with this generalized sense of works of law, he still seems to be focused especially on the kinds of elements of the Jewish law that a Jew might boast about. So there's no room for saying, well, I'm circumcised, so I'm obviously better and more spiritual than you are. So even though Romans is generalized, that we're not justified by works of law, meaning you can't earn, your right standing with God. There's still hints of this, the origins of this phrase, possibly, in debates over whether Jews and Gentiles, can have table fellowship together in Galatians 2. I don't know if that made any sense. If you have access to me, please ask. So we are justified. There's a new way. God's righteousness has now been revealed apart from performing the law, namely through the faith of Jesus Christ. Here's another one that, there's plenty of literature debating what does this mean. What does the phrase "through the faith of Jesus Christ" mean? Does it mean through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, or does it mean through faith in Jesus Christ? And again, people go round and round, and you find plenty. It's dizzying, the literature. I've come to believe that probably in this first instance, Paul meant through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. In fact, I wonder whether this was an expression with a history, to where the reason why it's ambiguous to us is because we don't know that people use this phrase in the early church. Through the faith of Jesus Christ, N.T. Wright points out that this doesn't mean the fact that Jesus believed, and it doesn't mean, through the faith of Jesus Christ, it doesn't mean that he was completely without sin, although he was, but that's not what this phrase means. N.T. Wright argues, I believe, correctly, that through the faith of Jesus Christ refers to his obedience to death, Philippians 2, his faithfulness unto death. And of course Romans 5 bears this out. Through the obedience of one man, many will be made righteous. Well, that's almost like a restatement of this passage. That through the faith of Jesus Christ we are justified. Through the obedience of one man, many will be made righteous. So I do think that the sense, and I agree with N.T. Wright, that the sense of the beginning of this Romans 3:20 and 21 is that now God's righteousness has been revealed in a different way than the law, namely God's righteousness as it is manifested in the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to death. And it is to everyone who has faith. By the way, so one thing N.T. Wright and Richard Hayes and others have pointed out is that if it means faith in Jesus Christ, then we have he says the same thing twice. Through faith in Jesus Christ to everybody who has faith. Well, why say it twice? What about through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to everyone who has faith? Then it's almost from faith to faith, like in Romans 1:17, starting with the faithfulness of Jesus Christ and resulting in our faith. I think that's the right interpretation. You're welcome to disagree with it. There are plenty of people who do. And it is it's a brain-twisting kind of issue. But, so, what is Paul saying? Here's the first sense. But now, God has revealed his righteousness in a way that bypasses law-keeping, even though the law and the prophets anticipated it. Namely, God's righteousness as it was demonstrated in the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to death for everybody who has faith. There's nothing unorthodox about this. It is a little different, especially if you grew up on kind of Protestant thinking. That's not the way this passage is usually translated. In fact, the only version, I think, that translates it something like this is the Common English Bible, which came out in the last 5 years, I think it was. But, by the way, another thing that we'll see when we get to Romans 4 is this does make God the Father the focus of our faith, rather than Jesus Christ the focus of our faith. And that is borne out in Romans 4. All the places where Romans 4 specifies the object of our faith, it's God the Father that is the object of our faith. And in fact, 1 Thessalonians talks about faith in God. So, actually, I believe that this is consistent with what we find elsewhere in Paul, that the focus of faith for Paul is theocentric rather than Christocentric. That's not to say that we believe in the God who raised Jesus from the dead, is the way Paul puts it in Romans 4. And of course, this is the way the book of Acts consistently says that God raised Jesus from the dead. So, slight shift in focus. It's not that either is wrong, it's just that this approach clarifies, I think, Paul and tweaks our understanding of Paul slightly. And there is no difference, Paul goes on to say, between Jew and Gentile, because both Jew and Gentile have sinned. Paul says all have sinned, of course, but by all, he is thinking both Jew and Gentile. Everybody's sinned. Not just Gentiles, but Jews have sinned too, and are lacking the glory of God. The background of this phrase, the glory of God, I think, is Psalm 8. There are some versions that translate this differently. So the NLT says, and have fallen short of God's glorious standard. I don't think that's what Paul's saying. Paul is not saying all have sinned and have failed to be perfect. That is not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying something similar to what Hebrews says. Hebrews says, for it is not to angels that God has subjected the coming world, but someone somewhere has said, what is humanity that you are mindful of them? What is the Son of Man that you visit them? You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. Then he goes on in Hebrews 2 to say, but we don't see everything under humanity's feet. In other words, we do not see humanity crowned with glory and honor. But we see Jesus, who became a little lower than the angels for a little while, that he might taste death for everyone and lead many sons to glory. So there is a kind of a backstory in early Christian thinking, early Christian tradition, that I think this verse alludes to. And that is, God created humanity with the intention for humanity to have glory and honor in the creation. But because of Adam's sin, because all have sinned, we do not have the glory. We lack, which is a perfectly legitimate translation of the verb here. We lack the glory of God. So therefore, all have sinned, both Gentile and Jew, and all are lacking the intended glory of God. But there's a solution. We are both, Jew and Gentile, justified, that is, declared righteous, deemed righteous, stamped okie dokie righteous, USDA righteous. We are declared not guilty. We are declared in right standing, in right relationship, in right, acquitted of all charges, freely on the basis of God's grace. Some key terms in this discussion. Justified. Justified means to be, again, declared righteous, deemed righteous, pronounced not guilty, righteousified, rightified. You got righteousness? This is a legal fiction, of course, because I had sins. But as we'll see in Romans 4, blessed is the one to whom the Lord does not consider or reckon sin. That person is justified. So Romans 4 will give us a nice clean view of justification for Paul, and it basically means I am considered righteous. I'm not really righteous, but God has forgiven me, He's wiped it away, and I am declared righteous. Notice, by the way, that something you can't see in English. In English, the word righteousness and the word justification or justified look different. But in Greek, the verb justify is dikaiao, and the noun righteousness is dikaiosune. And so, actually, to justify is to righteify. And justification and righteousness are the same basic word. So these are related context words. We can't see it in English because one begins with a J and one begins with an R. But in Greek, these are related terms, just like faith and believe are related terms in Greek. So justify and righteous are related words in Greek. So to be justified is to be declared not guilty. You can say, just as if I'd never sinned. That's true too, but that's how you get to a righteous status. To justify is not to just as if I'd never sinned is what happens after you are justified. The process of justification is the process of being declared. You are declared righteous. The verdict is not guilty. That's to be justified. Okay, what is grace? Charis. Here's another one. Grace and gift are related. Grace is the instance of giving a gift, and a charisma is the gift that is given. Grace means unearned favor, or they used to say unmerited favor, or God's riches is at Christ's expense is overload, but it's memorable. Grace is unmerited favor. By the way, grace can be solicited. So I can ask for grace. I mean, let's say that you cheat on a test. You can ask for grace, or you're late on an assignment. You can ask for grace. So grace is not something that can't be solicited. You can ask for it. Similarly, The key to grace in the ancient world, this is patron-client language. The key to grace is not that you do absolutely nothing, necessarily. You might not do anything. But the key to grace is that the gift is disproportional to anything you might do. So, theologians have wondered, isn't faith a work? If I am having the faith, does that mean that I am, in some sense, working toward God's grace? And that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, that's kind of some things you hear. In fact, I wonder sometimes if N.T. Wright, if that's in the background of his whole faith as a badge thing. But rather, grace means that you didn't earn it. Even like if let's say that my son has $5, but he really needs $50. Let's say he owes me $50, but he only has $5. Grace might take the $5 and yet count the $50 as satisfied. Do you see what I'm saying? Grace only means that the gift is disproportional to what is done in relation to it. And grace, also in the ancient world, patronage came without any formal obligation. But there could be expectations with grace, in the sense that, if somebody in the ancient world gave you a gift of grace, and then you began to make rude comments about them, or insult them, or make rude gestures toward them, you're not going to get grace anymore. So there were often informal expectations when some grace was given to you. So to suggest that God might expect us to be faithful to Him after He gives us grace, I know some Christian circles will say, well, that doesn't work. But that does work in the ancient context, where grace is a matter of patronage. So some key terms where the original meaning might be a little bit different from the stuff we tell each other in Protestant circles. Okay, through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus. So where were we? There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. All have sinned. Both have sinned. But both are justified freely by God's grace and through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus. Now, N.T. Wright thinks that the word redemption would have immediately evoked connotations of the Exodus for a Jew. Maybe. I don't know. It's not mentioned. This is one of those where N.T. Wright is a really smart guy, and maybe he sees things that aren't there. But I'm willing to believe that might be true, that Paul may be thinking of the Exodus when he says redemption. And then here's a very key verse in the New Testament. Through the redemption in Christ Jesus, whom God in his faithfulness offered as an atoning sacrifice by means of His blood. This word hilasterion, atoning sacrifice, is another high debate word. I mean, there's so compact and so many debates over all the phrases. It's kind of like taking over a city. Every block has a different fight. Atoning sacrifice, the RSV says expiation, which focuses on purification. King James has propitiation, which focuses on the wrath, satisfying the wrath of God. The NIV, I think, says means of atonement. That's plain and safe. That's true. I think what version calls it the mercy seat, because hilasterion was what the top of the Ark of the Covenant was called, where they put the blood. His faithfulness is offered as a Ark of the Covenant mercy seat, or a place of atonement, maybe. Some have suggested. I've never quite taken a position other than it means God has offered Christ as a sacrifice that atones, an atoning sacrifice. It certainly has that connotation. It may be more precise, but it definitely has that sense of Christ as a means of atonement. Demonstrating God's righteousness. You see how, again, the idea that it's God's righteousness that is primarily in focus, it fits with what we see Paul saying here. This offering of Jesus as a sacrifice demonstrates God's righteousness, even though He's passing over sins that have previously been committed. In His patience, He's waited. He didn't just zap us and destroy us. In the patience and the forbearance of God. So this demonstrates that God is righteous, and that God is the one who rightefies anyone who is from the faith of Jesus. Again, this is so cryptic. What does it mean to be from the faith of Jesus? Does that mean anybody who is justified on the basis of Jesus' faithfulness? Or does this mean anyone who has faith in Jesus, which is the way most translations do it? I just have to wonder if Paul meant both. If Paul's being clever here, nay, inspired, and saying, it's both. We are both made righteous on the basis of the faithful death of Jesus and also by our faith in Jesus. Could it be both? Okay. I'd ask for questions, but this is a recording. So, then we get to where is boasting? Where is boasting then? If you're a Jew, can you boast? If you're a conservative Gentile, as I believe many in the Roman church were, I believe many of the Roman Christians were conservative Gentiles. So, where is boasting? Can you boast? Nope, you can't boast, because it's not on the basis of these works. It's not on the basis of circumcision. It's not on the basis of law observance. It's not because you observe the Sabbath. It's not because you make sure that the blood is drained before you eat the goat. It's not because you don't eat meat that's come from a pagan temple. Where does boasting come from? It does not come from anything you do, but boasting comes on the basis of faith. Not that I boast in my faith, but I boast in the cross of Jesus Christ and in His faithfulness. The idea of it being the faithfulness of Jesus makes it even makes it even less about me and even more about Jesus, which I like that. That it is even less about my faith as about Jesus' faithfulness. So, is it where is boasting? It's excluded. Is it on the basis of what law? Again, he's flipped from one meaning of law to another. Here in this one passage, we've had three meanings of the word law. God's righteousness is revealed apart from law, namely through, although it's testified by the law and the prophets, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. By what law is boasting excluded? By what rule? A third meaning for the word. Is it the rule about works? No. It's excluded by the rule of faith. By the way, this word rule of faith has a history in early Christianity. It's an expression with a history. Augustine and the early fathers understood the rule of faith to be the core of Christian beliefs, the basic beliefs of the faith. That's not what Paul means, although I believe in the rule of faith. It's not what Paul means here when he talks about the rule of faith. Okay, so we get to this very important general statement. Here you have it. A person is deemed right with God. A person is justified on the basis of faith, apart from works of law. So it doesn't matter. You're not going to get right with God just because you only eat meat that's been prepared a certain way. A person is deemed right only or on the basis of faith. Okay, this is slightly different from James 2:24, which says, James 2:24 I think is in dialogue. I think James 2 is in dialogue with a perversion of Paul. A perversion of Paul that says, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to be righteous at all. That's not what Paul says. And so James says a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. That's what James 2:24 says. But James is basically saying faith without works is dead. If your faith is legitimate, it's going to result in certain behavior. That doesn't contradict Paul, because Paul himself says the fruit of the Spirit, that there's fruit to the Spirit. But Romans 3:28 is Paul's general principle of justification. A person is justified on the basis of faith and apart from works of law. So Paul's not putting down works of law here. In fact, he goes on at the end of this to say, do we ignore the law then? No, we affirm law, he says, which is kind of puzzling. But basically, Paul says God is not just the God of the Jews. So it's not just keeping circumcision and works of law like that. God is the God of the Gentiles too. So God justifies Jews on the basis of faith, and God justifies Gentiles on the basis of faith. There is one God of both. But he says we don't nullify law through faith, we establish law. What does that mean? I think we're going to find out later when we get to Romans 6, when he says, do we sin there? Therefore, that grace may abound. He's walking a fine line here, that we are not made right with God on the basis of works, But that doesn't mean that we affirm sin either. There are aspects of the law, especially love your neighbor as yourself, that are essential for a Christian. Christians should not let sin reign in their mortal bodies, he says. Well, I feel like I've talked a mile a minute, and this is a very complex, very dense, very highly debated stretch of Paul's writing. But these verses, especially Romans 3:21 through 27, I think it is, or 26 or 27, is the most central and important soteriological passage, I believe, in the entire Bible. So there you have it.